Hello, Patreon. Thank you for being here. My last update caused a bit of a stir on social media. When talking about this work I've been doing before anyone else has a chance to experience it, what I'm trying to do, or what I'm trying to avoid doing, rather, is giving anyone the experience they'd have watching a movie if for some reason they'd first gone out of their way to separately listen to the director's commentary track for that movie. Almost nobody would choose to do that for what I feel are pretty obvious reasons. So that's what I'm doing my best to try to avoid. I know that when I say something here, it won't take very long for people who haven't heard me say it to get some version of the information. And people are going to talk, Not everyone involved in the conversations about this podcast and the Patreon updates will have seen the Patreon updates for themselves. They're basing whatever they're saying off of a secondhand version of what I've said. And a lot of those people are going to get wrong ideas about what to expect. And I guess those conversations are just going to have to happen that way. I don't see much of a reason to try to individually respond to things I see people saying. Let them have their guesses, let them have their fun. They'll all get their answers when the second season does come out, I will say, though, with all due respect, it's my opinion that I remain the best source of information on this show, and I wouldn't put too much stock in anything you don't hear directly from me. So I'm just going to keep making these updates the way I'd want them to be made if this was a different podcast that I was just a fan of. So, having revealed several of the topics that will be included in season 2, I'm now able to start discussing the sources that I'm using for those topics. I know that the liner notes segment of Cocaine and Rhinestones episodes is really popular, and probably especially so with everyone here on Patreon. You probably heard about the Patreon by listening to the liner notes. So again, thank you very much for paying such close attention to the work that I'm doing. It really means a lot to me. The source material is pretty much just a huge pile for the whole season this time around, and it is a very big pile. I think I said in the last update that I had to learn how much different of a thing it is to tell one story completely than to tell a whole bunch of different stories. One thing that's different and a lot more work is you pretty much feel like you have to read everything about the person in your story. And there's a lot there when that person's George Jones. He started becoming a big deal in the middle of the 50s. The first real book was written about him in the middle of the 80s, and people have been writing books about him ever since then. He is the main person I'm focusing on in season 2, but there are still other people that I'll be focusing on in season 2, and the same thing goes for a few of them at least. As I also said in the last update, to tell one story really well, it's my feeling that you will sometimes have to kick over to a side story for a little bit. And one great thing about that is those side stories tend to reveal themselves. It's pretty obvious who needs to have attention placed on them. For instance, Billy Sherrill is someone that I'll be talking a lot about in season 2. He is not a person who's ever had a book written about him. It would surprise me if there ever is a book written on Billy Sherrill, because for a long time in the industry, there was not very much attention paid to the people working behind the scenes, even though when you're talking about someone like Billy Sherrill, this is an incredibly important figure. He certainly impacted the entire genre of country music in such a major way that very few individual people have. This brings us back around to a good thing about there being so much material out there on George Jones, which is that we do get a little info on those behind the scenes people in the deal. You read several books about the same person and certain characters are gonna stand out, names that keep coming up over and over again. And at a certain point, you start asking yourself, well, who was this person? Can I find out more about this person? In the story of George Jones, Billy Sherrill is very much a person like that. For those who don't recognize the name, Billy Sherrill was a producer who had a huge impact on the genre of country music. When George Jones started working with Billy Sherrill in the 70s, it had a huge impact on George Jones' career. He became far more successful. So Billy Sherrill is, of course, in every book that's ever been written about George Jones. And of course, Billy had already been producing Tammy Wynette since the 60s, so he's in every book that's written about her too. Then you go look at the list of everyone else Billy worked with, and yeah, fortunately, there are enough pieces out there to put together a story for someone like this, and I'm very happy to be able to do that. Because I do think it's important that fans of country music know who Billy Sherrill was and why he mattered so much. It's also an opportunity to step outside of the main or even secondary perspective that we'll have for most of the season and see things from a different angle. This is another thing I like to do. The sidebar on Neil Young in the Rusty and Doug Kershaw episode of season 1 is an example of this. I feel that the context given for who Neil Young was and where his career was at that time was absolutely necessary to understand who Rusty Kershaw was and why he mattered. Definitely necessary to understand what was going on in those on the beach sessions for us to see, okay, now it makes sense why this album is the way that it is, how all these things happened, etc., etc. One thing I don't have that would have been awesome is a sessionography, I guess, for Billy Sherrill. It would have been really incredible to have a list of all the recording sessions he was a part of, who the artists were, what songs were recorded, who wrote those songs, what musicians were playing there. It may not seem like it, but that type of data really comes into play a lot when you're trying to put a story together. I mean, I don't even have a complete sessionography for George Jones, if it tells you anything about how difficult this stuff is to come by. But I do have a lot of information on his sessions, thanks to the sources that I want to talk a little bit about in this update. Before I start, I'd like to make sure everyone understands that I was not paid or compensated in any way to talk about the things I'm about to show you. These are box sets from the German label Bear Family. That's a label many country music fans know and love. Their box sets can be a little bit on the pricey side. In fact, I did not even buy these for myself. They were sent to me from the Amazon wish list that's in the description here on Patreon. Thank you to Gary, if you happen to be watching, for sending me these. This isn't an unboxing video or anything like that, so I'm not going to show you the whole box sets. But it is obvious as soon as you open one why they cost what they do. The packaging is beautiful and everything. But the biggest surprise to me came with how much work clearly goes into putting together the liner notes. And it even feels a little ridiculous to call these liner notes. I mean, as you can see, this is just a hardcover book that comes with the Starday and Mercury recordings box set. And what they do is they set a writer loose, and that writer constructs a narrative around this data that is the recording sessions. And it's an example of what I mean when I say you can build a story around this data. Kevin Coffey did the Starday and Mercury book, and they gave Rich Kienzle the United Artists and Music Core years. And these box sets are the complete recordings of everything that George Jones recorded when he was at these labels, at least everything that is known to be a George Jones recording. I knew I needed to hear everything that George Jones recorded if I was going to talk about why he mattered so much to the genre of country music. Being able to put that stuff in chronological order, I also knew was going to be pretty important, even if it was only for myself. But having these specific box sets ended up being crucial. I know that not every box set someone buys comes with stuff like this. It's possible that Bear Family even puts out some box sets that don't come with stuff like this. But I do know that the ones they did for George Jones are very good. And especially after all this stuff is coming out about the fire at Universal Music Group's storage facilities, and we're learning just how many legendary master recordings very well may be lost forever. It seems like I should be talking about how important things like these box sets are. The music is amazing, of course. It's a wonderful experience to sit down and listen to everything that George Jones recorded for Starday Records, for example. The first record label that George Jones signed a recording contract with. You already heard me talk about him a little bit in the Shelby Singleton episode in season 1, and how their success with George Jones led to a merger with Mercury and how that dissolved. But that's nowhere near the whole story of Starday or even George Jones's time with Starday. That was just the bit you needed to know for the Shelby Singleton story. If nothing else, there are so many songs that Jones recorded for Starday, Starday, and Mercury that need to be discussed just for the sake of discussing those songs. In fact, there are plenty of Jones fans who will tell you what he recorded for Starday is the best stuff he ever did, and they don't care for much after that. But after Mercury Starday dissolved, Jones stayed with Mercury in Nashville, and from a storytelling standpoint, things get a lot more interesting there. For example, one thing that became pretty important to me was figuring out exactly when Johnny Paycheck started singing in George Jones recording sessions. The Starday box set was a huge help to me there. And continuing through the United Artists and Music Core years, I couldn't begin to guess how many times I came back to these books to answer questions like what other songs were recorded in the same recording session as this one? Which songwriters did George Jones keep going back to get material from? When was Jones' final duet session with such and such singer? So on, so on. These sessionographies were absolutely essential for answering those kind of questions. Going back to Billy Sherrill, there's no telling what it would add if I had this type of information on that type of man. Not even just for this season, but for the whole podcast. I mean, even having this much information about George Jones' recording career helps me do a better job of telling Billy's story, because I have all this information to set the stage for Jones beginning to work with Billy. And the Starday box set just came out in the year 2015, too. So this stuff is happening. This isn't from a long time ago. Another example of this kind of work is in 2011, I think, Bear Family again had Colin Escott, who's an author you've heard me praise on the show. They had Colin produce this series called Country and Western Hit Parade, Dim Lights, Thick Smoke, and Hillbilly Music. It's one disc per year. It spans about 20-something years. So that's 20-something individual discs, and each one of them comes with this little booklet. You put 20 of these booklets together. Basically, Colin found a way to write a book about country music. I don't know how difficult it may be to go to a book publishing house and say, I want to write about this 20 years span of country music. But Colin got one put out with a soundtrack, one chapter at a time, which I think is pretty great. And again, 2011, the Starday box set came out in 2015. These things are still happening. If there's any possibility of someone making a set of the complete George Jones recordings for his time with Billy Sherrill at Epic, it's way too late for that to be of any help to me for season 2, but I sure wish they'd do it anyway, because it's likely that it could help me with who knows what down the road. The information that comes along with these box sets and sets that are like them, from a historical standpoint, this matters a lot. I have no idea how profitable it is for Bear Family to do these box sets or for anyone else to do them, but I hope they keep doing it, And if you're a fan of this music and you have things like this, it doesn't have to be box sets, any good book that comes out about country music. I haven't seen it yet, but if that Ken Burns documentary about country music is good, I hope you'll talk about that. I hope you talk about the books that you're buying and make sure that it's worth these people's time to keep doing this stuff. Put your mouth where your money went, put your money where your interests go. Do this stuff. I can tell you for a fact, word of mouth makes things happen. It helps a lot. All right, I don't know exactly what I'll be talking about in next month's update, but I expect it'll probably have more to do with sources, since that's such a huge part of making this show. As always, thank you so much for being here. I hope you take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next month.